Okay, in this video we're going to be looking at the site and situation factors that determine location of industry. If you remember earlier in the course we did introduce the concepts of site and situation, and now they're coming back in a more specific way. Throughout this video, you're going to be considering site factors, which includes land, labor, and capital, situation factors, and then the idea of bulk gaining or bulk reducing industries, and the types of transportation that are used in modern industry. So in class we discussed what is industry and the importance of the Industrial Revolution. Now we're going to look more specifically at where industry is actually located based on site and situation factors. So looking at situation factors from the bulk reducing perspective, this is all going to be based on the proximity to inputs. In other words, the resources or things that are used in the manufacturing or the production of a good. And that the factories themselves are going to locate themselves near those resources or inputs because they tend to be too expensive to ship or too bulky, in other words, to be able to transport to a factory at a great distance. So the classic example of this in the United States is in the steel industry, in the steel mills of the early 20th century. When you look around the Great Lakes region and you look at the deposits of coal and iron that were around the Great Lakes region that are both important inputs into the creation of steel. The steel industry is located near those bodies of water because they could easily be transported across the lakes or nearby from the coal fields or the coal mines. And so, those heavy inputs that they have to transport in order to make something that also is very difficult. And the steel mills themselves were located right on rail lines that went right into the urban areas or also near the auto manufacturing near Detroit. So looking at the idea of a bulk reducing industry, we're just looking at something that is too heavy to actually transport before going through the manufacturing process. And so some of the weight or the bulk is lost in the process, making it a little more efficient or cost effective to ship to market when it's completed. Another situation factor we look at would be concerning proximity to markets, or proximity to markets is the bulk gaining industry. This is where we have something that's being produced that's adding bulk or weight that makes it expensive to bring to market, to have it shipped. In other words, the inputs themselves maybe aren't that heavy, but when you put them together in the finished product, it's heavier or more difficult to transport. It could be bulky. Usually it's because of weight, but it could be just because it's a difficult good to transport. But things like fabricated metals, beverage production is a classic example that when you take bottles or cans of anything, that adds the liquid weight, makes it very heavy and difficult to transport. And so we see this these locations are going to be very near the place where they're going to be ultimately be consumed. And so some of the examples, again, are the beverage industries, a bulk gaining industry, perishable products like milk, where you want to get it very quickly into the market, into the hands of consumers, or what you call single market manufacturers. This is something like car parts, that there's maybe a factory that makes a very specific part for Ford cars. Well, most likely they're going to locate themselves very near Detroit, Michigan, where many of the Ford cars are produced in America. So proximity markets for bulk gaining industries and proximity to inputs for bulk reducing industries. And again, based on the cost of transportation. What you might realize is that we're starting to look at some very similar characteristics as we did in agriculture, that ultimately businesses or consumers factory owners and just as farmers are trying to make a profit, and so they're going to try to minimize their costs as much as possible. So when we consider either bulk reducing or bulk gaining industries, we also consider what are the costs of transportation. And that has changed drastically over time. And so today, when we look at the different types of transportation, whether we use shipping containers, railroads, trucks, or air, is largely going to depend on what type of good it is and whether or not what's the bulk of the actual finished good that's being transported. Because the different types of shipping methods have different advantages and disadvantages. And so when we look at the cost, to ship by container ships, it's very cheap, but it's slow and it's not as accessible to all the markets as other methods of transportation. Trains tend to be for longer distance and very bulky things, but again, oftentimes there's what's called a break of bulk point, where maybe the train or the ship is unloaded onto semis and trucks, where they're going to be usually transported for shorter distances to bring to market. The last one we can look at is the air travel. This is very fast, but it's limiting in terms of how much weight you can use, and it's very expensive relative to the other methods of shipping. So situation factors are really important for industry because depending on what they're producing, they're going to need to know what method of transportation they'll have access to, and also what is going to be most cost effective. Now, transitioning to site factors, there's three major ones that are going to affect site. Now, site is going to be what is it like once you're there. So there might be great situational factors, but there's three major things that are important for site factors, and you might remember these same concepts from economics. One is labor, and this is probably the most important because it's the most expensive in the production of any good or service. That the cost of producing or of anything, there's an input of labor, usually the human effort into the product. And usually businesses that are very labor intensive are going to focus on locating themselves where labor is relatively cheap. A perfect example of modern day economics, global economics, is looking at Bangladesh and their garment industry. Because labor is so cheap, you see many clothing manufacturers having their clothing and garments produced in Bangladesh because that's where the labor costs are the lowest, even if they have to ship it a great distance to get it back to the U.S. markets. Another factor is land. In the past, factories would locate, because of the site factor of labor, factories would locate right in urban areas where the labor was accessible and very nearby. And usually they had small footprints. In other words, they had vertical oriented buildings. In other words, they'd have several floors, and the factories would be at various floors in the building, but it was usually in urban areas where they could get to labor. Today that's changed because a more effective method of production is to have these factories being more horizontally or using much more space. It makes it easier to produce and streamline the production process, and land tends to be much cheaper than an urban area. What's changed? Well, we can look at the distribution. There's freeways and highways. The population has shifted out of urban areas and into more rural or suburban areas. And we've also added more mechanization, so less people are needed to, in terms of human labor to produce things. So this has become a very popular model in present day manufacturing. But again, keeping in mind, even if it's in a rural or a suburban area, usually these are going to be located on very accessible routes of transportation, whether it's on a direct rail line, a major interstate highway, near a major airport, etc. The last one of site factors is capital. When we look at capital, we often think of the equipment or machinery. We talk about that in economics, the things that help you produce more things. But we also think about the capital that's used to purchase or obtain those resources. And so there's a financial capital. And capital also is where you can find those other human capital, like people with the same skills. But usually the funding or the expertise or the resources in order to expand or to run a business. A perfect example of this would be Silicon Valley in the United States. Outside of San Francisco, California, this has become the technology hearth or center of really global technology. And there's a lot of capital that flows into any company or engineer or ideas that have merit. There are oftentimes resources that that people are willing to give to those ideas to see if they'll flourish. And so if you are a technology company, it's likely you will relocate or at least have an office in Silicon Valley to be able to access those capital resources or take advantage of the commonality of industry that is located there. If you look at Silicon Valley, it's one of the most heavily invested areas in terms of capital today in American industry. So, Hopefully, this is a brief summary. You can highlight the different factors of site factors, situation factors, and then the difference between bulk gaining and